think we get caught up in too many dichotomies. To future-proof an institution, by definition, you have to think slightly differently than the strategy that got you where you are today.
Hello, and welcome to the Future of Universities podcast series. My name is Arno Meerman, CEO of UIN and your host for today. In today's episode, we bring you a conversation between Cameron McCoy, Provost at Shenandoah University, and Scott McKinley, founding partner of McKinley Hodge Group and former global lead of the ProServe Academy at Amazon Web Services. In today's discussion, Cameron and Scott will explore how universities need to adapt to cater to the changing needs of employers and provide examples on how to future-proof universities. We hope you will enjoy the discussion.
It's a pleasure to welcome Scott McKinley. I'm just awed by everything that he has done. And, very quickly, Scott is the global lead for the ProServe Academy, which is an internal corporate university supporting career development of Amazon Web Services, worldwide public sector professional services. But prior to that, he's led innovation in higher education to employment efforts for nearly 20 years all around the world, and co-founded the Newmont College of Computer Science, led strategic corporate engagement at Cisco and their IoT education program, and enabled Laureate Education's entrance into Asia, while also building, scaling a high-growth higher education program that enabled university students to acquire in-demand professional cloud computing services. And he now is driving change at one of the largest companies in the world, Amazon. So, big topic today, Scott. I want to just sort of anchor this with sort of your story. I just read your bio really quickly. I didn't do it any justice, I'm sure, but I recall talking to you previously and felt like we could probably talk for about 7 or 8 hours about everything higher ed. So could you just give us a quick background on where you're from, where you started,
Sure.
and how you got where you are?
Thanks, Cameron, very much. Hopefully we'll be able to share some thoughts. Cameron, with your guidance, we'll hopefully have a really open and nice conversation. I grew up, Cameron, in a family of educators. My parents and grandparents on both sides of my family were public school educators and a little bit of community college education administration thrown in there as well. I was fortunate, I guess, in that my parents both had gone on to do bachelor's and my father had done a graduate degree. So education was sort of the family business, was the family dinner table conversation. I never thought in my life that I would be an educator. But after a career around the world globally in the investment world, venture capital and private equity and some investment banking, I simply ran into the world of education. And what intrigued me about it, and this is going back nearly 20 years, what intrigued me was that it felt to me like an industry or a service sector that had been doing what it had been doing for centuries and had never really caught up with the world as it was changing rapidly. And I think while all of us as educators understand that learning and upskilling ourselves is a key ingredient to being relevant in the classroom and for our students, it just felt to me that the institutionalized nature of education around the world had not really kept up with the 21st century needs. And so I was intrigued by that, having such a large sector of the economy that felt to me like had outstanding people involved in it. Teachers' hearts are in the right place, but I just was very curious to understand what possibly could we do different. And so that led, in the early part of my entrance into higher education discipline, that led to the founding of Newmont University, which is now Newmont College of Computer Science.
So big jump, right? Finance, investment banking, big dollars there, and then you make a big jump and decide we need a new college because we're not responsive. Maybe we can dive back a little bit further into the history of higher education, and that might help us anchor some of the thoughts moving forward here. I read an article the other day that was reflective of the fact that most people in higher ed don't understand our own history. And our inability to change over time, even though we have made some incremental changes, nothing substantial. And it seems to be like we're in a sort of a repetitive cycle here of embracing change and fighting change and embracing change and fighting change. And I assume here that Someone could have had this very same conversation minus the technology side of it back in the 1950s and again in the 70s and 80s and 90s, right? And so,
Yeah, I'm so fascinated by the history of these institutions. I mean, history was probably my first love academically before I jumped into other pursuits. But I mean, when you literally read about the history of Harvard in 1636 and starting with 7 students, or Stanford and Leland Stanford Sr. founding Stanford on the west coast of the United States, but you read about these institutions, there is actually a lot of learning, and I think a lot of lessons that Stanford nearly went bankrupt in the early stages because once Leland Stanford Sr. passed away, his estate was caught up in a massive antitrust lawsuit in the United States at the turn of the last century. And Mrs. Stanford refused to allow the then president to shut down the institution. He encouraged her to close it for a period of time. She refused to do that. She funded the school through her own personal stipend from the court that allowed her to draw on the family's wealth. And even the motivation to found the university on the West Coast, I find interesting. Like the son had gone to Harvard and passed away at a very, very young age. And, the story goes, assuming it's true, the story goes that Mr. and Mrs. Stanford got on the train, which they owned, the Union Pacific Railroad. And they took the train to Boston, met with the then president. They were deeply offended because he didn't recognize their capability to contribute to the university. And so on the way home, Mrs. Stanford said, well, if it only costs $5 or $10 million to found a university, why don't we just start right now? And so they did. And the rest is history. But you look at the roots of these institutions, and it's really fascinating, Cameron. I think about an institution like Carnegie Mellon and its history, with Andrew Carnegie founding it, who essentially came from, Scottish background, immigrant to the country. And these were the pioneers and the early builders of this continent and this country of the world. And other institutions, I think, have incredibly interesting legacies, and the founding and their roots are, I think, potentially quite instructive to what they were then, what they are now. And are they comfortable as an institution being what they are now? Or somehow they lost, maybe some institutions have lost their way a little bit. Maybe they've lost some of that founding DNA that was part of their original roots. It's a question I would have if I were a senior leader of an academic institution. What were our roots, and does it make sense to at least consider whether part of our founding DNA is still recoverable, and is it still embedded in the institution today?
So you're pulling on a thread there that sort of resonates with me a lot. I mean, this idea of all institutions starting to look the same. And I think that really started in, I would say the 1970s and 80s in particular, where we started to see rankings and the Carnegie classifications. Speaking of Carnegie Mellon, not the same thing, but certainly in the U.S. anyway, we started to see this isomorphic tendency to look like every other institution, and certainly that's had some positive and probably negative impacts. But when we spoke before, one of the things that you brought out was the premise that today we sort of have too many missions. Can we dig into that again?
First of all, I truly believe that a big disservice in the higher education sector is this. Candidly, I view it as almost a lemming-like march off the cliff around mission. I just don't believe that everybody should be pursuing a full range of mission activities around research, teaching, and community service. And I just think it's too broad of a mission. I think for most institutions, particularly if they consider their financial resources, if they consider deeply what you might call from a strategy perspective, their hedgehog. What can you truly be the best at in a Western Australia context, or in a Gold Coast, a site on the Gold Coast in Australia, or in an Indonesia context, or in any other geography? What can we truly be the best at doing, I think, is a relevant question. And it might not be this broad, comprehensive mission that some institutions have adopted. I'm not a big fan of that. I really believe in finding our hedgehog, so to speak, to use that analogy or to use that strategic concept. What can we be the very best at? And let's double down and focus on that. And in my humble opinion, and maybe this is a little bit of sort of Amazon speak here, and I apologize for that, but at Amazon, we found that obsessing over our customers and working backward from their needs tends to put us in an ability and a strong ability to innovate on their behalf and to deliver value for what customers need in terms of lives. Whether that's our retail side of Amazon.com or it's our technology side, it's the various dimensions of our service for customers around the world, whether those are business customers or public sector customers, including universities, or our commercial and industry customers. I think that methodology would potentially work quite well for an institution to think about what Clayton Christensen at Harvard Business School used to call, what's the job to be done? What is not all of the jobs to be done, what's the job to be done that we as an institution of higher education could do at least as good, if not better, than any of our adjacent institutions?
In context, right? So context
Yes.
matters, as you already pointed out. And with loose apologies to my colleagues in higher ed who are dismissing this conversation because Scott used the dirty word of customers, translating that to higher ed. I mean, I think what we're talking about here is centering learners, right? And let's put learners in the middle of the discussion rather than putting staff and administrators and sometimes faculty in the center of the conversation. And if we can start to really center around learners, that gives us the ability to design in context and perhaps build a strategic plan that has some strategy to it, because most of them don't have any strategy.
Look, I know, Cameron, that the customer word is a little bit of a dirty word. The sacred elephants that we don't really want to always acknowledge, I think, in education is the word customer. The word training is loaded with huge amounts of baggage and potentially negativity, depending on what sector of education. If it's a dual sector player in some countries, for example, they get a little more comfortable with it. Community colleges get a little more comfortable with that concept. But to me, I like to use the phrase, can we stop using the or word around strategic choices for universities? Could it be and? Could we have student-centered learning and treat them somewhat as customers, as it were, to use the dirty word there, and still be meeting our other obligations around strategy? Could we have a training and an education model, instead of just it being, this is only about long-term thinking, long-term education, the usual discussion around that, around the dichotomies. I think we get caught up in too many dichotomies, when in fact, to really to future-proof an institution, by definition, you have to think slightly differently than the strategy that got you where you are today, if we're going to future-proof ourselves.
So let's dig into that future-proof idea a little bit more. I think it's an interesting bit of language to use, right? I mean, there are a lot of folks talking about the future of higher education or future universities. That seems to have grown quite a bit. Maybe they're copying my friends at UIIN, but future proofing seems to be an even more future focused or forward thinking bit of language. When you see future proofing the universities, or what is your reaction to that idea?
Well, I guess, Cameron, maybe it goes without saying, but maybe we need to state the obvious, that to me, the COVID pandemic has been an accelerant to the challenges that universities were already facing. If a university was financially stressed prior to COVID, what does their balance sheet and what do their financial resources look like today compared to 12 to 18 months ago? I have to believe that there's a deterioration in the balance sheets and in the financial capacity of most institutions today. Are there some that have deep endowment funds and resources that they can weather the current storm? Of course. Are there some that have other resources that they can fall back on? Yes. But I believe that COVID has been an accelerant to put additional pressure on a sector and on higher education institutions that already were under pressure around their financial model and sustainability, around a series of challenges. So to me, future-proof actually takes the concept one step further, and it actually acknowledges that maybe, just maybe, many institutions of higher education are actually on what I would call a bit of a burning platform. And that requires taking decisive action. You can't, I'm very nervous. I would be very nervous about any academic institution today sitting back and said, it's all fine, this will pass, we can continue on with business as usual. Once we get past this current crisis, let's not worry about demographic trends. Let's not worry about these other challenges. It's all going to be good, right? Hear no evil, speak no evil, see no evil. Let's just ignore it all. It'll all go away. I cannot imagine if I were on the board of trustees of higher education institutions, and I've been on several, that would be a conversation that our board would be comfortable with, let alone among the senior leadership of an institution. So to me, then the conversation, and I know you have a lot of background in this as well, fine, so talk is cheap. What are we going to do strategically to future-proof our institutions? What are the proactive steps that institutions, I think, should be considering? To me, that's the topic, not whether they're challenged. They are challenged, whether they're the degree to which an institution and its leadership and or the faculty are agreeing to that or not. I truly don't believe that's worth a debate, right? I think the debate and the discussion and the dialogue needs to be what can be done pragmatically, specifically to help an institution, a university become future-proof.
So I'm maybe a little more skeptical than it sounds like you are. I mean, we certainly are. I agree 100%. I mean, we're in the midst of this significant collision of crises, whether it's COVID or issues of race and equity or climate change or a downturn in the economy, or changing demographics that are forcing us to think about what the definition of a learner is, and more traditional institutions starting to recognize we need more bachelor's degrees and we can't do that with only 18 to 22-year-olds. All of those pressures are upon us. And yet at the same time, I think we are seeing what you're pointing to, and that is that a lot of people just want to get back to what was, and everything will work itself out. And so is this really the black swan moment? I mean, what is it that's going to push us over the edge and make senior administrators and make faculty change the way we think about higher education and address our systemic ills?
I guess, Cameron, I see several drivers. One, I believe that students, and whether they're traditional age students and their parents who are gatekeepers and funders of the more traditional age students, or they're adult students, I believe that learners themselves have raised their expectations on what they're looking for from an educational experience, right? And so the concept, at least, and again, I'll speak a little bit from a US perspective for a moment, but the concept that only a certain small percentage of high school students, of secondary students, were expected to go on to higher education, which was how the US high school system was engineered after World War II. It was built for a world in which only about 20% maximum of students were expected to go to higher education. In today's world, to not have further and higher education as part of your career pathway, the income level, as you mentioned, the equity and access issues, they're very, very severe. So I think we have a situation where, again, the student and the learners are in a stronger position with higher expectations of what their needs are, and are those needs being met by the institution. Then let's pivot around, let's go around the stakeholder community for just a second. Then you have industry. We've all seen the data. There are no more hidden data around, or is industry convinced that the students who are coming out of the traditional programs are fully prepared? Is there high fidelity and alignment with industry? I guess is the way to succinctly phrase that question. From industry's perspective, the answer is not so much. Big challenge, right? All right. I think those two stakeholders or constituencies within education are driving. And now we have, in the public sector, we have governments that are continuing to sort of wrestle and grapple with their own finances. Again, think global financial crisis circa 2008. Now we lead into the COVID crisis of 2020. Governments are as indebted as they've ever been. It's very difficult to squeeze more blood out of a turnip, to use a funny phrase, right? But I think that's another stakeholder, constituent that typically would be funding higher education around the world in the public sector, but it's very, very difficult. And then in some countries, you have demographics where you have relatively high growth. And so you need to create more post-secondary capacity. But how do you do that if government can't fund the seats, right? So those three stakeholder groups, in my mind, students, employers / industry, and then governments, are three key stakeholders that most institutions of higher education would be wanting to pay attention to, right? Because so I guess if you're not, that's going to create some challenges. And again, maybe they're on a burning platform. If they are paying attention to those three groups and how to meet perhaps their needs or address the challenging issues around that, then I think we're in better shape.
So maybe in summary here, what I'm hearing you say is that we ought to be listening to the internal university stakeholders, particularly our learners, and centering their needs, and understanding the jobs to be done for them. Certainly understanding the jobs to be done with our colleagues in industry, which we serve in a number of different ways. And then, our government entities understanding that the jobs to be done with them, and perhaps taking some lessons from the U.S. on how you navigate downturn in public funding if you're outside of the U.S. And maybe if you're in the U.S., trying to understand how public funding of higher education has continued to persist and how we might rekindle some of that. So really thinking about the intersections of university, industry, and government, and the jobs to be done in context, maybe helps us find a way to put the fire out on the platform.
Yeah, I agree. And look, on the public funding side, I mean, I'm aware of legislators and politicians and so on. I mean, they're not anti-education. They would like to fund education. I think what frustrates what frustrates our government funders is they keep wondering, is there actually a faster, better, and cheaper way to do this? Does it actually cost this much for a university degree with all of these features built into it? Or is there actually a more efficient and more effective way to deliver what we're doing? And that's not a question, I think. I mean, I might don't want to offend the entire audience here, but I don't believe that's a question that higher education has drilled deeply enough on, is to understand, faster, better, cheaper, three strategic concepts. But again, could we deliver that in that degree? Could we actually even improve it potentially through either industry alignment, through internships, co-ops, apprenticeships? Could we improve the overall experience, but actually deliver that at a lower price point? Because remember, in the public sector, it's the government typically, and increasingly now parents and students that are paying for the privilege of going to higher education. And not all of them can afford it. And some governments can no longer afford to fund education at the levels that they were funding it at historically.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of leaders in higher ed that are afraid of the idea of competency-based approaches, or even modularizing education and moving away from the left to right linear pathways that we're used to. And I think part of that is this acknowledgement that there's a potential to lose the value of the things we don't provide any credit for. Maybe it's certainly in the public square, we've lost the voice of the liberal arts and the humanities for the sake of STEM. And I think are we on the way back to having that conversation and starting to say, well, wait a minute, the human skills actually matter, and we have to be really intentional about the way we deliver and credentialize those? Or are we moving to a place where this is more of an apprenticeship, or somewhere in between, or combination thereof? I mean, what's your perspective there?
Look, first of all, I'm somewhat of a product of liberal arts education. So I strongly believe in the human skills and professional skills, or soft skills, depending on what term you want to use. I truly believe that. I guess my question is, is the only way to produce those in a traditional 4-year liberal arts degree at a named institution, at an elite institution? I'm not convinced of that at all. I actually believe that project-based learning, challenge-based learning, there are other learning methodologies that could very clearly create really strong interpersonal skills that apply to 21st century careers and knowledge. So that's my own personal belief. If I think, one thing that I'll share maybe that might be useful, Cameron, if I think about some of the things that we did at Neumont, just to harken to that experience for just a second. Who gets to start a university from a whiteboard or a plain sheet of paper? Like, clearly we were, a little bit crazy to do that, but it was a very interesting experience, and I think we built something that's somewhat stood the test of time. So what did we change? Like, if you could change anything, if you don't have all of the infrastructure and architecture of a large comprehensive university, well, first of all, we changed the academic calendar. I couldn't understand why it was required to spend 4 to 5 years to earn a baccalaureate degree, when in fact, from a contact hour perspective, you could earn it in as little as 2 to 2.5 years. And so we made that change with faculty support. We taught 40 weeks a year, every year. So by going year round, but that simple change, which was not that complicated to enact, that simple change suddenly cut the cost of a degree for a student because you're saving 2 years of room and board and you're saving 2 years of employment income, right? So that was one change. The other change, plenty of academic research supports project-based learning. It's just very difficult to install project-based learning into existing degree programs at a major university. I know that Tech de Monterey has done this most recently in the last year, so that's probably a case study worth looking at deeply. I was very impressed that they were doing that across all of their campuses in Mexico, and they have over 30 campuses. So it was a big undertaking. But at Newmont, we were able to start and build the curriculum from the ground up that was entirely project-based. I'm only aware of 2 institutions in the world that have done that. One was Republic Polytechnic in Singapore, and the other one was Newmont College or University in the United States. And so that was a fairly big pivot. And the last change, I felt, and some institutions do a pretty good job of this, I believe, I really felt strongly that aligning with industry from the beginning was going to be key. That for a professional bachelor's program where strong career opportunities were a key part of the value proposition to students, that engaging with industry. So about 30% of the program or so really were industry projects working for large or small to medium-sized companies. So those were the 3 dimensions of differentiation for that institution. I think some of them are still relevant in this future-proofing conversation for universities, but just to share that with the audience as well.
Well, you beat me to it. That was my next question, so I'm glad you went there. So just sort of looking back on that Newmont experience, and if I recall, that was, I think, the spring of 2006 when you launched it, right? And now it's a full-scale university, and somehow is scaled itself and is continuing to deliver. So incredible story there, and I think we're probably not doing it enough justice, but there's not a lot of people I meet every day who just said, you know what, we've got to fix this, and I'm going to start a college to do it, and really intentionally focus on it and make it a reality, right? And so there certainly must be some learnings that we can take away as we think about future-proofing the university moving forward. But let me ask you this: are there lessons that we could take from companies like Amazon? I mean, I know you're doing some internal educating as the global lead there at the ProServe Academy. Maybe first tell us about ProServe, and then maybe some lessons we might take away from that as higher education folks.
No, thanks, Cameron. So look, the professional services arm is we have both public sector and commercial sector, but we have teams of consultants who work with our customers, again, state and local governments, public sector, higher education institutions, and others. And that team really works on the strategy and digital transformation strategies for those institutions, both governments and educational institutions and nonprofits. So we have a team. My task currently is to upskill, onboard and everboard that team of growing consultants in every geography around the world. And then, and we do that on the commercial side as well for various industry sectors. So that's very challenging work and very enjoyable work. My prior role that I think falls on, and you mentioned briefly, was really scaling from pretty much the ground up a higher education program to upskill students for our customers, for their future employers around cloud computing skills. And what I found interesting in that program, it was quite interesting, Cameron, to see the various universities and how they would respond to this value proposition of a commercial entity coming to them and saying, we have curriculum, we have content and courseware we would like to give you, we would like to offer this, along with professional development training, use the training word, or professional development for your faculty and your lecturers, instructors around the world. And by and large, most institutions of higher education actually welcome it. They understand, they've seen that model before from a number of other technology companies and providers. There are a few resistors, of course, I mean, especially at a research institution where faculty wear so many hats, right? There's a publication hat, there's a research hat, there is a teaching load, and it's very difficult sometimes for a tenure track or a tenured faculty member to engage in and sort of constantly upskilling, especially as rapidly as the technology world is moving. Having said that, over a relatively short period of time, we were able to scale that program to tens of thousands of students at more than 1,000 institutions around the world, in higher education institutions in every major geography. And I really applaud the faculty for that, because nothing would happen. Doesn't matter if the president thinks this is a good idea or not. Those types of industry aligned programs do not happen without faculty and educator buy-in and a commitment on their part. So I'm really give a shout out to the individual faculty members around the world that they're willing to jump into the fray, so to speak, and engage in closing that gap with industry through some support on both sides.
So Scott, we have about 4 minutes left here, and I have a page and a half full of notes from you. So one of the premises of this fireside chat, the concrete steps, right? So I've tried to capture these here, but maybe you want to add to them. So knowing your history, but recognizing the present seems to be one of those, right? Centering learners seems to be a concrete step. Designing in the context of your own institution. Listening and developing contextually, again, the jobs to be done for university, industry, and government. And then, sort of backwards planning and being not afraid to fail and innovate and continuing to focus. Measuring the KSAs as you noted them to get to an educational value add around, has there been any actual learning done? And then this last one around the story, right? So this premise of changing the language and the story to those out there who are investing in us as an industry. Am I missing anything in those sort of 7 concrete steps?
We have a leadership principle at Amazon called bias for action. I honestly think, in addition to those sort of strategic drivers, Cameron, I would include bias for action. I think that university leadership, presidents, vice chancellors, provosts, vice provosts, I think that leadership needs to take the innovation and the future proofing seriously enough that they're willing to take some risk and innovate and take some action. And again, I mentioned earlier briefly, but I think being willing to align curriculum with industry needs through programs similar to one that I was running at AWS Academy or similar programs, being willing to listen carefully to industry and identify, how do we build a bridge between what I call the supply side and the demand side. I think looking at partnerships, there are a number of ed tech / third-party companies that are doing and having a meaningful material impact on the sector right now. And I think that universities need to embrace those. So you don't need to do it all at once. We can't boil the ocean. We're not going to change the direction of a higher education institution, especially one that's 5 or 6 centuries old, overnight. But I believe that having a leader around innovation and then letting that senior leader begin to test, experiment is critically important to get institutions to figure out the model going forward.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And really great point made by one of our attendees here in the chat as well, this idea of education value add being socially framed. And you're exactly right, Keith, and certainly as Scott just noted here, the bias towards action applies when we have questions of equity and social mobility. The challenge is on all of us to do that every single day. And I certainly wake up and think about that myself and challenge myself to act with real intention around equity. So Scott, I want to thank you for being with us today. It's been real fun to talk to you again. I'm gonna hold on for yet another minute and let's see if we have one more question pop up. But if not, is there any way that folks could reach out to you? Do you want to?
Yeah, no, I'm happy. I'm pretty active on LinkedIn and messaging there. So I would encourage anybody. I saw some great questions coming through on both the chat line as well. Then I know we didn't get to everything, so I apologize for that. But to Keith and Karen and others that did ask questions, if you'd like to reach out to me on LinkedIn just for an offline conversation or address things, I'm happy to be a resource. And obviously I'm fairly passionate about this space that I've invested a fair bit of my career in. But I'm convinced, Cameron, that there is change occurring, and I really applaud the efforts. I mean, most of the people I'm sure attending this are are trying to figure out ways to advance the mission of their institutions and so-called future-proof their institutions. And so let's do that. We can do this. And I would end on a positive note. I think the combination of innovation internally, innovation going on externally, a desire by students and industry to see these changes. And I think there is a win-win, if I could use that phrase. I think there is a win-win that can be done with enough thought, careful thought, some strategy, and then frankly, at the end of the day, some execution around bias for action and just trying and getting the flywheel turning a little bit. So really great to be with you. Any last question we can address, or should we call it a?
I agree with you 100%. And thanks so much. And it's been a pleasure to spend time with you today. Thanks everybody.
Take care, everybody. Bye now. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to today's discussion. Stay tuned for the next episode on the Future of Universities podcast series. Follow us on Spotify and LinkedIn, and don't forget to sign up for our podcast newsletter at uin.org.